The wind screamed across the deck as black waves rose like living mountains, crashing against the ship's iron hull. The sky had turned into a monstrous canvas of thunder and fury, the kind that swallowed prayers before they could leave the lips. Captain Marcus Hale stood at the helm, his coat drenched, his hands white-knuckled around the wheel. The storm was a beast, but so was he, or so he liked to think. His crew staggered across the deck, pulling ropes, shouting warnings, and fighting to keep the ship alive. They had been at sea for 6 days since the radio died, and Marcus refused to turn back. "We're not cowards," he had barked earlier when his first mate, Jonah Reed, suggested finding shelter. "We sail through it." His words were sharp, proud, the kind that silenced men. Now the sea was answering his arrogance with rage. Jonah stumbled up the steps, his voice almost torn apart by the wind. "Captain, the bow's taking on water. She won't hold much longer." Marcus didn't look at him. "Then bail faster," he growled. "No one rests until we clear this storm." Jonah stared at him, rain streaming down his face, torn between duty and despair. The crew's eyes followed every command, their faces pale, their faith fading. The captain they once admired had become a ghost of leadership, unyielding, cold, and blind. They had seen him push men past exhaustion, refuse to share rations, and demand obedience even as hope sank lower than the horizon. Yet none dared to defy him. Not until the sea decided enough was enough. A wave taller than the mast rose like a black wall before them. Marcus barely had time to shout before it struck. The world exploded in sound and chaos. Men screamed. The deck split with a groan that felt like the ship itself was crying. Marcus was thrown backward, his head striking the railing, blood mixing with saltwater. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled. The ship was dying, and for the first time in his life, Marcus felt small, so small. Jonah crawled toward him, drenched and desperate. "We have to abandon ship," he shouted, grabbing the captain's shoulder. "The lifeboats. Now." Marcus shook his head violently. "I'll not run from the sea," he rasped. "You'll do as I say, Jonah." But Jonah's eyes had changed. They weren't the eyes of a subordinate anymore. They were the eyes of a man who'd seen too much. "The crew's done following your pride, Captain. You want to die here, that's on you. But I won't let the others drown for it." Without waiting for permission, he turned and shouted the order. "All hands to the lifeboats. Move." The crew hesitated for a heartbeat, torn between fear and loyalty, then one by one, they moved, because deep down, they knew Jonah was right. Marcus staggered toward them, his voice hoarse, almost breaking. "You'll disobey me," he roared, but the wind swallowed his words. The men were already cutting the ropes, lowering the boats into the raging black. A lightning bolt tore the sky apart, illuminating the chaos below. Marcus saw his crew, his men, helping each other, pulling the wounded, shielding the weak from falling debris. They were moving as one, not under his command, but out of something purer, humanity. And it stung him like fire. He felt the sting of every cruel word, every moment he'd made them fear him instead of respect him. The sea had taken his command long before it took his ship. Jonah climbed into the last boat, looking up at Marcus one final time. "Come with us," he shouted. "You don't have to go down with her." Marcus's heart thudded. Every instinct screamed to hold his ground, to be the captain to the very end. But beneath that pride, a quiet voice whispered, "Don't make your death another punishment for them." He took one step forward, limping, and then another. The deck groaned, splitting beneath him. Suddenly, the sea surged upward, swallowing half the ship. The mast collapsed, and Marcus fell hard. Pain shot through him, sharp and merciless. He could see the lifeboat drifting away, Jonah's hand outstretched. He tried to crawl, but the water was faster. A wave crashed over him, pulling him toward the darkness below. He gasped, choking on salt and regret. The last thing he saw before the sea swallowed him was the light of the flares rising into the night sky, his crew surviving. The sea took the captain, but it spared the ones he had failed to protect. Hours passed. The storm moved on, leaving behind wreckage and silence. The lifeboats drifted under a pale dawn. Jonah sat soaked and exhausted, staring at the horizon where the ship had vanished. Around him, men shivered, prayed, and wept softly. No one spoke of the captain. But deep in their hearts, there was no hatred, only sorrow. Marcus had been a hard man, but he had built the ship they now clung to. Without him, they would never have made it this far. And somehow, that truth felt heavier than the sea itself. 2 days later, a rescue vessel spotted them near the coast. When they were pulled aboard, Jonah stood silently as the medic wrapped his arm. The captain of the rescue ship asked what happened. Jonah stared at the horizon for a long moment before answering. "The sea took him," he said quietly, "but it let the rest of us go." The words hung in the air like a prayer. In the weeks that followed, the survivors were scattered across ports and cities, carrying pieces of the story like fragments of driftwood. Some said the sea took Captain Hale as punishment, others said it was mercy. Jonah, however, couldn't forget the last look in Marcus's eyes, something almost human, almost apologetic. He spent nights hearing the crash of waves in his dreams, the captain's voice blending with the storm's roar. But over time, that memory softened. He began to see Marcus not as the tyrant who ruled the ship, but as a man who had lost himself trying to be invincible. Months later, Jonah stood on a pier, watching a new crew load supplies onto a freighter. The sea was calm that morning, shimmering like glass. He closed his eyes and took a breath of the salt air, then turned to the young sailors behind him. "Out there," he said, pointing to the horizon, "the sea doesn't care about rank or pride. It only respects those who respect each other. Remember that." The men nodded, wide-eyed. Jonah smiled faintly, the kind of smile Marcus never wore. When the ship departed, Jonah stayed behind, alone with his thoughts. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small compass, Marcus's compass, retrieved from the wreckage days after the storm. The metal was corroded, the glass cracked, but the needle still pointed north. He turned it over in his hand, whispering under his breath, "You found your way after all, Captain." Then he tossed it gently into the waves. The sea accepted it with a small ripple, as if acknowledging the offering. Years passed, and stories about the lost ship became seafarers' lore, tales told in harbors to warn young sailors about the dangers of pride. Some swore they saw a ghostly vessel appear on stormy nights, its tattered sails glowing faintly under the lightning, a lone figure at the helm. But those who spoke of it never did so in fear. They said the ship didn't come for vengeance. It came as a guardian, steering lost sailors away from danger. The sea, it seemed, had forgiven its captain. One night, decades later, an old Jonah sat in a seaside tavern, surrounded by a few young sailors who begged him for one last story. He laughed softly, the wrinkles around his eyes deep with memory. "You boys ever hear about the ship called the Meridian?" he began. The room grew quiet, even the waves outside seemed to pause. Jonah's voice dropped low. She was commanded by a man who thought he could tame the sea. But the sea doesn't bow to anyone. When pride filled his sails, it tore them apart. And when he finally learned humility, it was too late. One of the boys leaned forward. "What happened to him?" Jonah smiled faintly, his eyes distant. "The sea took him," he whispered, "but it saved everyone else." The young sailors sat in silence, their hearts heavy with the weight of those words. Jonah looked out the window toward the dark horizon. The tide was high, the moon reflected on the water like silver fire. Somewhere out there, he felt, Marcus Hale still sailed, not in defiance, but in peace. The story of Captain Hale became more than a cautionary tale. It became a lesson whispered between generations of seamen, that leadership is not about command, but compassion. That strength means nothing without humanity. And that sometimes, the greatest act of courage is not to fight the storm, but to admit when you've been wrong. As the years went on, ships came and went, storms rose and fell, but the legend endured. Fishermen who survived rough seas would sometimes say, "The captain was watching over us tonight." And when the waves grew too high, and the wind howled too loud, they'd whisper his name with respect, not fear. Because in the end, the sea had taken his life, but it had also carried his redemption to every corner of the ocean. And on certain quiet nights, when the moonlight danced across the waves, old sailors swore they could hear the faint echo of a man's voice carried by the wind, firm, steady, and calm. "Hold fast," it would whisper, "and take care of each other." Those who heard it never doubted what it meant. The captain who once ruled with iron had become the guardian who guided with grace. For the sea, in its infinite mystery, doesn't forget. It punishes pride, but it honors change. It takes what is broken, and if given enough time, returns it whole. That was its gift to Marcus Hale, and to the men who lived because of him. In the end, the sea took the captain, but it saved his soul.